In Python, if you need to get the values of the keys and a key that does not exist, then you try and retrieve the value for it, you will normally get an error if you try and do this. Now, an alternative way is using the get method. The get method allows you to input a default value. Now, if you don't put a default value in, it will return a none. But if you put a default value in, such as an empty string, then you will get that empty string. So if I run the first one here, and as you can see here, you will get an error. So here you can see an error has happened because the country does not exist. But then if you run this with the get method, you will get the country, which is now a blank, or we can call it default. And you will now get the default value printed here if the key does not exist. In Python, you don't have to create an error object. Instead, use the existing built-in one, such as value error, and then you can pass your custom message to that error object, and then you can print that error message using the following two methods. You can use the e.args method here, and then it would be the first element because it's 0 element based, or you can simply write print e, and this will print your error message. The reason you have to do this because the messages are stored as a tuple, so in order to print them, you need to be able to access the element. So if I run this, and as you can see, the error message is printed whether you use this method or simply you can use print e, and this will still print your message. Did you know that you can pass in two messages into your error handler? You can separate your messages with a comma, like shown here. So you've got square root is undefined for negative numbers. And then you've got the second message, please provide non-negative numbers. This will get passed into your error handler, and you can access it using e, so which is the value error exception, and then as e.args, and then the first element, and then you can capture your second element. This might be useful if you have a custom interface and you're trying to display two separate messages into your interface. So remember, don't use delimiter, instead use tuple, which is what this will actually generate. Do not use the generic error objects in Python to raise errors. So for example, if you want to raise an error to say negative numbers are not allowed in your application, don't do this and pass a custom message and then handle the error. Instead, what you need to do is create a class that inherits from exception and then define your message in here, allow an argument in here to apply the number. And then when you raise the error, it is very clear from the error name, negative numbers are not allowed. So this makes it much more clearer and easy to debug your code later on when you do this. So you will get a message output here. So if I enter -5, you will get this error message here rather than something that is generic. This code would be too generic. So instead, make sure you inherit from the exception class and create your own error object, which would be a class. And then when you raise the error, it is very clear from the error that what you are raising. Whereas here, as you can see, it is not very clear what type of error you are raising. A lot of people do not know this, that you can use the inspect module to actually interrogate the code within another module, as long as it's a Python module. So, for example, let's say you've got this add function, which you're importing from my module. This my module file is somewhere else and you don't open it. What you can do is you can use the inspect.getSource, and you can use in the argument, you can pass in the function name, and it will print out what that function does. So for example, you can see here that we can see the output of that function, the definition of it, which is add AB, return AB. And this is what we get. This is actually what's shown in here. So as you can see here, you can see the add function that it matches definition here. But this cannot be done for built-in modules, such as the math module has ceil and the float functions. You cannot use inspect.getSource because that will actually result in an error. So if I run this again, and as you can see, we'll get an error because the code written for the math module is in C language and not in Python. So you can only use inspect.getSource for Python modules. So whenever you need to look at a definition of a function in another module, just use print inspect getSource and the function name. One of the most useful things in Python is the ability to see what each module has. So for example, if you've got the math class here and you want to see all the functions available within the math class, you can actually use the dir command, DIR, to list all the functions within it. So you just surround it in a print. And then if I run this, as you can see, all the functions within the math module here. And you can see so you have functions such as log, field, floor function over here, pow function here. And if you want to find out what does each function do, you can do help. And within the help, you pass it an argument of math.pow, which is the function name we saw. And if I run this, as you can see, the first command runs here, which lists the functions, which is this one. And then pow function explained here, which basically says it returns x multiplied by y, x to the power of y. So this is how you can get built-in documentation in Python and then know how to use functions in imported modules. Did you know that you can use the help function in Python to retrieve documentation on any of the modules within Python? So if you want help on the math module, you can use the help function, pass it an argument of math, and this will output the documentation for you. Now here, as you can see, the documentation is very limited, but if you press enter, you can then scroll one line at a time here. Or you can use spacebar to scroll multiple lines at a time. Alternative way of doing this is using the Pydoc. With Pydoc, it's again a built-in module in Python. You can render the full help documentation of the math module. If I were to run this, you can see now we don't have to press spacebar or enter to scroll one line at a time. You can actually see the full documentation here. And this is stored in a variable, so you can manipulate it in various ways as you wish. There are more ways to do this, but these two might be useful in certain situations, especially if you don't have internet connection or you're traveling. You can use the help, or you can use the Pydoc render method here. Python has this cool built-in feature where you are able to open up a web server and launch Python help documentation. So if you type in this command into your terminal and press enter on it, what it will do is open up a web server hosted locally, and it will show you the documentation of all the modules that are installed on your system, including the built-in modules, as well as all the other ones that are installed within your system. If you click on any of these links, for example, the math library, you are able to get the details and help documentation on the math module and are able to browse through that here. You can use this to access help locally without having access to the internet. There are two ways to create dictionaries in Python. One, which is this method using the curly braces, and the other one is using the collection. So what's the difference between them? If you use the one without the collections and you try and access a property that does not exist, you will get an error message like here. If the country does not exist as part of this object, you will get an error. But if you do the same thing and access the country here, this time you won't get an error. The only difference in creation of the dictionary is you pass it a default object, which is a string class. It will actually generate an empty string for items that are not found for a specific key for that dictionary item. If I were to run this, as you can see, you will get Alice printed, but then you will get an error to say the country does not exist, key error. But if you try and do the same thing using collections, what you will get is you won't get an error. Instead, you will get an empty string. And as you can see, Washington DC is printed, and then you get a blank space here to just say there is no item found for that specific key, and it won't error in your Python code. This might be useful in certain situations. Error handling is very important in Python. You should stick everything that could error within a try block as shown here. You should then capture each of the errors we can get. In terms of this situation, we are dealing with a division. So a user can pass within the input a non-numeric character. So then this error would be triggered and it would be captured here. And then we go into the except. This would be a division by zero error. This would be triggered here. And then we've got else here. This is if there are no errors, this will then run. The finally bit will always run no matter whether there is an error or no error. So if I run this here, if I pass the value 10, you can see that we've got please enter valid numbers. So this is captured in this value error. Now, if I then do 10 divided by 0, then you will get the division by 0 is not allowed, which is captured by this error. And if I enter everything correctly, as shown here, and then you can see we get the answer, but you will also see the operation completed is printed as well as the calculation success.